South Korea is hoping to seal a separate deal with the U.S. that will offer it an exemption from an existing nuclear cooperation pact, allowing it to pursue its plan for nuclear-powered submarines. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello, hope your work week is off to a good start. It's Monday, December 22nd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. We start our panel session this week with a look at the latest efforts by South Korea aimed at advancing its nuclear submarine plan and more. For this, I have freelance journalist Yang Chien-Hao from Taiwan here in the studio. Chien-Hao, welcome back.
Good evening. I was here last Friday and now I'm again here on Monday. So I hope everybody won't mind about that.
I'm sure they will not. You're most welcome. We also have Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Women's University live on the line. Professor Park, as always, it's a pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me again.
Right. We shall start here in the studio. Chien-Hao, let's begin with details of National Security Advisor Wi Sung-lac's talks with his U.S. counterpart Marco Rubio over in the U.S. last week, as well as, of course, the U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright.
So I remember during the Gyeongju APEC summit, the United States President Donald Trump has agreed to allow South Korea to build up its own nuclear-powered submarines. That's what we have discussed 2 months ago. And now the United States currently holds the one of the world's most advanced nuclear-powered submarine technology. And because South Korea's existing diesel-powered submarines are limited in the underwater endurance, and for this reason, President Lee Jae-myung directly asked President Trump for the United States supply of nuclear fuel-powered submarines so that South Korea could proactively take on more missions and help ease the burden of the United States forces. And during the APEC, I was on the briefing of the South Korean presidential office, and they clarified that this move is not aimed at any specific country, but also explained to reporters that the nuclear fuel is military use and therefore not covered under the current Korea and United States nuclear agreement, which have later to be revised. And so Mr. Wi Sung-lac's current visit to the United States is precisely to work out feasible plans on how South Korea can build nuclear-powered submarines and how uranium enrichment should be proceed and how to handle the spent nuclear fuel. And after concluding his trip, Mr. Wi told the reporters that these 3 lines of work will be pursued in a parallel starting next year. That means that all of the things will be pushed in the same time. And as for the legal and policy basis for building nuclear-powered submarines, he cited like Australia as an example, noting that under the AUKUS, the AUKUS, AUKUS framework, a trilateral security partnership between Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States, Australia has obtained the United States presidential approval and then signed a separate agreement with Washington. And if South Korea followed the same path, it could effectively break free from the constraints from the existing Korea and the United States nuclear agreement. And Australia plans to build nuclear-powered submarines by using British reactors and United States highly enriched uranium fuel and an updated estimated cost of $368 billion. And South Korea and the United States have already reached a consensus to move forward in a similar way. However, everything is still at very beginning, very initial stage. And Mr. Wi's visit to the United States as President Lee Jae-myung's special envoy is meant to underscore how serious that South Korea takes this issue. And the National Security Office has set up a nuclear submarine task force and the uranium enrichment task force in the hope of speeding up the process going forward.
Right, and staying with this, of course, Professor Park, Bloomberg covered remarks by South Korea's top security advisor Wi Sung-lac regarding prospects of a separate deal, which Chien-Hao mentioned earlier, with the US, of course, to build nuclear submarines. For the sake of our general audience, Professor Park, please do explain the necessity of such a separate agreement.
Well, South Korea already has a nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States, but that agreement is strictly for peaceful civilian purpose, things like nuclear power generation and research. It does not allow nuclear materials to be used for military purpose, even when those materials are used only for the preparation, not for weapons at all. That's the core reasons a separate agreement become necessary. Nuclear-powered submarines are not the nuclear weapons. They do not carry nuclear warhead by definition. What makes them different is that they use a small nuclear reactor to generate power. This allows them to stay underwater much longer and travel further and operate more quietly than conventional diesel-electric submarines. But even that kind of a preparation requires access to nuclear fuel and highly sensitive technology. And under the current ROK-US agreement, those transfers are simply not allowed. So when South Korea's top security advisor, Wi Sung-lac, talks about a separate deal, he's really pointing to a legal and institutional gap. Without new arrangement, Seoul cannot legally receive the materials or approvals needed to pursue nuclear-powered submarines, no matter how strong the strategic case may be. From Washington's perspective, this is not a trivial decision. The United States is extremely cautious about the nuclear technology transfer, especially in a region as sensitive as Northeast Asia. Any separate deal would need a very strong safeguard to make sure nuclear fuel is not diverted and that global non-proliferation norms are upheld. From Seoul's perspective, however, the strategic logic is becoming stronger. North Korea, we all know that North Korea's submarine-launched missile capability are advancing, China's naval presence is expanding, and South Korea is being asked to play a larger role in regional maritime security. So nuclear power submarine would give South Korea greater endurance, flexibility, and deterrence capability, especially in extended operation alongside with the United States.
Right, and with that intention in mind, Defense Minister, perhaps An Gyubek last week unveiled his ministry's roadmap for nuclear submarines. This was made during his ministry's policy briefing to the president. Could you share the blueprint with us, Chien-Hao?
Yes, there are two major parts. The first is the plan to present by next year a basic framework for South Korea's indigenous development of nuclear power submarines, which will cover construction methods and locations, as well as the establishment of key institutional and infrastructures. And at the same time, Seoul will also clearly state its position on nuclear non-proliferation. I think the move comes aimed at what appears to be highlighted a lot, not only in South Korea, but also in China, following the United States announcement allowing South Korea to build nuclear-powered submarines. And the second key point is the goal of completing by November 2026 the verification procedures for the second phase of the transfer of wartime operation control, so-called OPCON, OPCON, OPCON. At present, this authority has exercised by the ROK and United States Combined Forces Command, but in the future, it will be transferred to a future Combined Forces Command mainly led by South Korea. And in fact, Seoul and Washington have been discussed the OPCON transfer for a long time. It was in 2006, the two countries have already agreed to pursue the transfer through a three-stage evaluation process, of which two stages have already been completed now. So the final stage is scheduled to begin next year in 2026, and the South Korean government hopes to finish this last round of assessment by November next year so that it can secure the greater degree of wartime command Authority. And Minister An also stated that starting next year, South Korea will be establishing a standing pan-government task force to pursue this project as a national strategic initiative. And through this, South Korea plan to conclude negotiation with the United States within 2 years.
Right. Professor Park, despite Mr. Trump's general support, of course, for South Korea's nuclear submarine ambitions, pundits believe hurdles remain. What perhaps are some of the potential challenges that you would choose to point to, and how should South Korea seek to overcome them?
Well, that's a very important question because even with President Trump's political support, this will not be an easy process. I would like to point to three major challenges. First, there is a legal and institutional hurdle in the United States. Even if President is supportive, nuclear technology transfer are governed by United States law, particularly the Atomic Energy Act. And they involved Congress, multiple agencies, and very strict non-proliferation rules. Australia's AUKUS still shows that this can be done, but it took years of negotiation. It took more than 3 years and very detailed safeguards. So South Korea should expect a long bureaucratic process, not a quick political decision. And second, there is a regional and diplomatic challenge. Any move involving nuclear technology in Northeast Asia will immediately raise concerns in China and possibly in Japan as well. Even though nuclear-powered submarines are not offensive nuclear weapons, perceptions matter. If this is seen as destabilizing, it could trigger regional pushback or even an arms competition. And finally, there are domestic and technical challenges inside South Korea. Nuclear-powered submarine requires specialized infrastructure, trained personnel, long-term funding, and public support. This is a decade-long capability, not a short-term project. There will also be a domestic debate about cost, safety, and strategic necessities. So in short, even with the political support from President Trump, the obstacles are legal, diplomatic, and practical. The key for the South Korea is patience, transparency, and close coordination with the United States, treating this not as a shortcut to greater power, but as a long-term alliance project.
Right, and against this backdrop also, Chien-Hao, there are quite a number of commentators who assert that nuclear submarines could pave the path to nuclear weapons in South Korea. Could you tell us a bit more about their comments and your takeaways?
Like just what Professor Park has mentioned, that indeed the nuclear-powered submarine is not nuclear, it itself is not nuclear weapons, but since it needs very high level of technologies and skills, so many people are indeed like suspicious, like will it make like South Korea be able to reach any like other kind of like nuclear weapon producing skills or other techniques in the same time. Let's break down how each side sees these issues. First, the North Korea doesn't have a nuclear-powered submarine yet, but in March 2025, it was this year, in the beginning of this year, the Korean Central News Agency announced that it is under construction indeed, and many experts believe that the technology likely came from Russia. And we already know that North Korea has its nuclear weapons, and if it also deploys nuclear-powered submarines, then the threat to South Korea becomes even more serious. And since Seoul cannot develop its own nuclear weapons to respond until now, some people are arguing that at the very least, South Korea should be able to build up its own nuclear-powered submarines. Right now, only 6 countries operate nuclear-powered submarines, including United States, China, France, India, and the United Kingdom. And now, as I've just mentioned, like Australia and South Korea are now both moving to join the club by developing their own nuclear power fleets, submarines throughout. It might take very long time. But there is a real pushback. Some experts pointed out that the United States, which has the world's most advanced nuclear submarine technology, has spent over the past 60 years trying to tightly controlling it and actively trying to stop it from spreading. And now by agreeing to let South Korea build up its nuclear-powered submarines, Washington is in effect giving Seoul the latent nuclear power status that could make it even harder to convince North Korea to give up its own nuclear weapons. So why did Washington approve that? The reason is like intriguing. Speaking as a Taiwanese journalist, the calculation seems clear that beyond deterring North Korea, it seems like the United States is also positioning South Korea's capabilities as part of a border strategy to counter China.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Park, beyond South Korea's nuclear submarine agenda and ahead of his trip to the U.S., National Security Advisor Wi Sung-lac said he would seek common ground with the U.S. on engaging North Korea. This being said, what's your take on the absence of the term denuclearization in the latest security documents of the U.S. and China?
Well, it is important to understand that the three countries do not mean the same thing, even if the word of denuclearization itself is something missing, as you just mentioned. For the United States, officially still maintain the goal of the complete denuclearization of North Korea. We see this clearly in joint statement from South Korea, Japan, U.S. foreign ministers meeting, as well as in forums like Quad and in many other cases. Now, it's true that the comprehensive new North Korean policy has not yet been formally announced by the Trump administration, but it is very likely that denuclearization will remain part of the Washington's official position. That said, there is also uncertainty. President Trump, because does not always strictly follow or prioritize established policy framework, if another U.S.-North Korea summit were to take place, how denuclearization would be handled remained an open question. South Korea's position is somewhat different but still clear. Seoul has already announced the so-called AND initiative, which is the official North Korean policy, and the D stands for the explicit the denuclearization. So for South Korea, denuclearization is still very much a core policy objective, even if the wording is sometimes handled carefully in broader strategic documents. And China, meanwhile, has taken a noticeably different approach. Since around 2023, China has largely removed the term denuclearization from its official statement and documents on the Korean Peninsula. But interestingly, if you ask Chinese officials or scholars privately, many still say that denuclearization remains part of China's long-term vision for the peninsula. And now, from the North Korean perspective, the goal is very clear. Pyongyang does not want denuclearization talk. What it wants in arms control or nuclear risk reduction negotiation with the U.S., while maintaining its hostile relationship with Washington and keeping it at least part of its nuclear arsenal.
Right, and staying here on the Korean Peninsula, Chien-Hao, in South Korea there is heated debate as we speak, which has been triggered over the potential lifting, that is, of the ban on North Korean state media. Could you give us some background information, and what are your thoughts regarding this particular debate?
Yeah, so it was last week there were 12 lawmakers from the ruling Democratic Party proposed a bill to lift the decades-old ban on North Korean websites, allowing South Korean internet users to freely access North Korean media, including Nodong Sinmun. And as many of you guys know, like in South Korea right now, if you want to try to connect on North Korean websites, it will show like a page of warning, right? And eventually you're unable to access that unless you use a VPN to climb the wall and read it. And this proposal passes, we'll be able to connect directly to the North Korean websites without any hassle. I've seen some conservative supporters criticizing the ruling party lawmakers and even President Lee as a sign of pro-North behavior that could sway ordinary people's views on North Korea. And the main opposition People Power Party also mentioned that the government and the ruling party still have not provided a sufficient explanation of what positive effects this course of action will have on South Korean national interest and security. So it is very difficult to avoid criticism that this reflects to ideology more than sound policy making. But if you ask civil society groups in South Korea, including progressive activists and organizations that have long monitoring on North Korea, I believe some of them might be conservative. They are generally positive about letting people view North Korean media or that kind of contents. They argue that opening up access is a completely different issue from whether the folks will actually get brainwashed by the content itself. After all, North Korean media is packed with, political propaganda and leader worship contents. Most regular South Korean readers, I believe, they will probably won't have the patience to slog through it. And for researchers or journalists like us covering North Korea, though, easier access to the official media, those kind of contents will make our jobs a lot smoother. Let me share Taiwan's experience, because back before democratization, accessing Chinese media like People's Daily, those kind of things in Taiwan was also super risky. You could even get convicted for it. You might go to jail. But now all kinds of Chinese media sites just loaded fine in Taiwan. You can just freely connect it to CCTV, to People's Daily, to Xinhua News Agency, and other Chinese media. And so local Taiwanese people, they don't fall in love with China just from reading the official outlets. Instead, it's fake news and information warfare that really messes with public perception. Those are scarier because of mixed truths and lies in the same time, and making it hard to verify it, and it's also easy to believe, right? And so rather than threatening that opening North Korea media will harm South Korean society, I think it will be smarter to build up media literacy among the public. And that way, not just against North Korea, but even with South Koreans on political argument, that people's citizens, they will be able to spot who's spreading malicious rumors and twisting public debate on key issues.
Right. Definitely, this is something we can speak about more in our future sessions as well, hopefully. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this session. Chien-Hao, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. Professor Park, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we say goodbye for this Monday. We return same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday, so do join us then. Thank you for now.